Todd Wilkinson started his career as a violent crime reporter in Chicago in the mid-'80s. He's now been reporting on the state of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem for more than 30 years. In 2017, Wilkinson launched Mountain Journal, the online journalism site that today has over 150,000 followers on Facebook. He remains a correspondent for National Geographic and The Guardian. Todd, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's great to spend time with you guys.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you coming on. Well, you and I, we've been working together through Mountain Outlaw and EBS since I emailed you out of the blue in 2015.
That's right.
Well, I'm proud to be working with you in Montana during an albeit a very strange time in the world and in journalism. I wanted to ask you, how has this pandemic affected Mojo and the way you and your team report stories?
Well, it's fascinating. It hasn't really affected my lifestyle at all because I am an introvert who stays locked up anyway, but it hasn't affected the ability to generate stories. In fact, there's been a yearning during this time for people who want to be able to reflect on what's going on. And, it's not only the COVID story, it's the story of Greater Yellowstone that people can't wait to get back to. And there's a lot of interest in that. There's a lot of interest, in terms of the national politics affecting public lands. And so, if we had written a business plan for Mountain Journal in August 2017, we'd be way off the tracks now. And it just speaks to the iconography and this great appeal of Greater Yellowstone that stretches around the world. I mean, we have readers in 200 countries and, every state and Canadian province. So there's a lot of interest in our region.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Todd, you and we've spoken about the pace of life before COVID-19 and the pace of life now, in the midst of the pandemic. What are some upshots to COVID and the way it's affecting our lives?
Good question. So let's talk about the downshot first. I'm the son of restaurateurs from Minnesota, so I get how this is impacting people and business people, and I really relate to the world through the eyes of people who use sweat equity to make a living, whether they're in large companies or small, they're job creators and all of that. And it's as if we were a water dependent community and we're suddenly dealing with the flash drought and we don't know how long this is going to go on. And so we need to get, we're in this region that depends upon global tourism, which is going to be the water flowing back through the spigot, and we don't know what's going to happen. So there's that downside. I empathize. I'm here because I love the region and I love the people. But I think the upshot is that just as this has been this rare rallying cry for us coming together, in Bozeman at 8:00 every night, people howl. And so this coming together, we just had Give Big in Bozeman, and they raised a record amount of money for various nonprofits and charities. And so there's this empathy that's going on. But I think the big upshot is that it's really an opportunity. This could be a timeout where we can reflect on our region and reflect upon why we're here and really reflect upon what separates Greater Yellowstone from elsewhere in the world. I've had the good fortune of being able to travel around the world to a lot of wild places. And this place stacks up as well as any place I've ever been. It's a luxury to come back. And I know Eric and I have spoken about this as well. And we have these communities. We need to be paying attention to the people who feel left out, the people who are struggling in our towns, and the irony of conservation creating these great lifestyle communities that has come at the expense of, working class folk. But, we also, there's this notion of to whom much is given, much is expected. And there's really an opportunity, I think, for us to come together and try and figure out how are we going to save this place? How are we going to prevent Greater Yellowstone from following the same kind of mind-numbing, destructive path that has doomed a lot of other areas with high ecological values? And just to throw this out there, we are the place where we have the only assemblage of large mammals that was here at the time Europeans arrived on the continent. The only place in the lower 48 states, one of the only in the world. We have the longest wildlife migrations for elk, mule deer, and pronghorn. We have grizzly bears that we brought back. We reintroduced wolves. We saved trumpeter swans. We saved bald eagles. We still have wolverines. We have bison descended from 24 animals that survived the slaughter. We are the cradle of American conservation. And, there's a lot of great places to go recreate in the West, tons of them, but there's a reason why people in Vail are moving to Big Sky, and it is this mystique of this place that we have. And I think Mountain Journal, what we try to do most of all is remind people that the great advantage that we have here is we have this miracle of wildlife that still persists on our landscape. We could decide to say, it's expendable, let it go away. Or we could decide to step up to the plate and try and secure the things that these critters are going to need in the face of profound growth and climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's an incredibly special place that we have here. Todd, you've spoken about the pandemic, relationships, empathy, the megafauna here. What are the biggest issues you've been reporting on in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and have those shifted over time as you've covered this region?
So when I started covering the region, at that point, it was really traditional resource extraction, logging, mining, hard rock mining, oil and gas development. There were some issues related to overgrazing of livestock and conflicts with predators, but much of that's been addressed. There's still an issue of oil and gas on the southern flanks of the ecosystem, but we've really moved to this thing of if you protect it, people will come, and they've come in droves. So let me just throw a few quick stats at you. You look at Bozeman's growth rate, and you use the rule of 72 where you factor the growth rate in, you divide it into that, and you get the amount of years that it's going to take to double. So with Gallatin County and Bozeman growing at a 4% growth rate, it means that we're going to double every 18 years. So what does that mean? It means that 110,000 people turns into 220,000, or Salt Lake City proper, not the whole metro area, in 18 years. It means that in 18 years, there'll be another 100,000 houses asserted upon the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, replete with all of those impacts. It means that by the middle of this century, and we know from hearing to Eric and hearing from Mr. Fay that there's a lot of interest here. People look at a map during an event like COVID and they want to come here. And, I have no doubt that we're going to persevere through this and the economy will return again. And the real question is, how are we going to deal with these challenges? So apart from growth, we have, record outdoor recreation that's happening. And then we have this wild card of climate change. And if you talk to the premier climate change scientists, and we have one of them at Montana State University, and Kathy Whitlock, who's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and her colleague, Bruce Maxwell, there's already been documented changes in terms of precipitation and warmer temperatures that have happened over time. And that has profound implications for a place like Big Sky and Bozeman and Jackson Hole, where we have this great fly fishing economy, and we have a lot of ranch owners who rely upon water for irrigation. So, this is really the time, it's this pause when we can think about what we want to do. And as you and I have spoken, you can't save this place unless you're aware of the issues, and you can't plan unless you know what you want to become. I was just on the phone today doing a review with a number of architecture students from MSU, and they've done these wonderful plans looking at landscape level issues. And we were talking about the mystique of Greater Yellowstone. What I said was, wild places are defined by the wild things that live there. And in that regard, this place is extraordinary. But also, wild things don't exist in places where there are lots of people. So if you look at the Front Range of the Colorado Rockies, or the Wasatch, or the Cascades, or the Sierra Nevada, they don't have the wildlife values we have because there are so many people there. So we really have to figure out if, we're not going to stop growth. We're not going to stop people coming. They're going to come. And we really need this plan, a vision, a way to plan for how are we going to accommodate and achieve this balance between ecology and economy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Huge questions there. And, Todd, let's talk solutions. I mean, how important is dialogue during a time of tremendous growth like this, of sprawl in some ways? What other solutions do you think are out there?
Well, fundamentally, let's all, while we howl at 8 o'clock in support of our emergency workers and our entrepreneurs out there, let's remember why we love this place. And that unites us around common values. We're all here for a reason. And I think it's something worth celebrating. So it starts with that. But the other thing is getting our municipal and county governments. Let me throw out one example. There is not a permanent ecologist on staff of any of the counties in Greater Yellowstone, nor in any of the major cities. And so as we're thinking about decisions, and without ecological input to sort of advise people on what's at stake, you can't blame an elected official to make a decision if they're not aware of what those ecological values are. And I think one of the great inventions of the last 5 or 10 years, and I would encourage everybody listening to do this, go to Google and Google elk migration map, Greater Yellowstone, and you'll get this wonderful map that shows the elk migrations of Greater Yellowstone. And you'll see these 12 different herds that spoke out of Yellowstone National Park like a bicycle wheel. And they end up in the far-flung corners of Greater Yellowstone. It's a pretty darn cool thing. That doesn't exist anywhere else. The only other place in North America that's comparable is the porcupine caribou herd in the Arctic. And so it's these things of common values and this raising of ecological literacy. Let's do it with pride. That when we embrace that, we start having discussions about what do these critters need to survive, particularly on the public land base, but also what incentives can we provide? How can we help our ranching and farmer neighbors that when they have critters on in the wintertime, they need the winter range? How can we as the public step up with some of the conflicts, and how can we resolve them so that those critters find a home on private land during the winter time? Interestingly, all of this stuff is solvable. And I'll just say this. In Jackson Hole, you have Teton County, Wyoming, the richest per capita county in the country. In Bozeman, Montana, you have the fastest growing micropolitan city in the country. In Big Sky, Montana, you have some of the most powerful and creative people who have founded companies and they're leaders in whatever they do in the country. And so we have all of this brain power that's with us, and we can resolve, I think, and address not only the human issues of equity and inclusion, but we can also get at these issues and figure out a way with people like Greg Fay. How do we help find people who have, conservation in mind? And, one more stat. a multi-billion-dollar industry is built on this thing called Nature Inc. From trout fishing to wildlife watching, you know, to people who come to Big Sky in the wintertime and they're interested in critters. So this stuff, we have powerful things that serve as motivators for us to do the right thing. And I think it's there. We just have to come together.
Yeah, absolutely, Todd. Well, thanks for that. And I think the dialogue is key. That's what, you know, we as journalists are trying to do. That's what many people in this area, there are a lot of conversations going on. I think I agree with you. It's important to sit down with people to have that dialogue. You know, I have one last question for you. You know, you recently completed an interview with science writer David Quaman for Mountain Outlaw magazine. What were a couple highlights of your conversation with him? You guys go back a ways.
So David has been a longtime friend and neighbor, and it's been fun having curbside discussions with all of his books, getting a preview, if you will. So a couple of things that really unite David's interest in the natural world. One, most recently with spillover, is the cause of epizootic diseases and pathogens, and we're dealing with one of those now with COVID-19. And as David says, we are in this remote corner of the West, and yet we're 1 or 2 airline flights away from Wuhan and a few hours away. And so we're not as insulated as we think. The second thing is David wrote a book called The Song of the Dodo, and he talks about the consequences of fragmenting natural landscapes. And in the case of COVID, that was a result of bringing wildlife out of their habitat, bringing them to a wet market, and exposing people to the viruses that they carry. We have some issues like chronic wasting disease and others in Greater Yellowstone, but the issue really is ecological integrity and the unraveling of ecosystems that can come with fragmentation. So in Greater Yellowstone, we have 22.5 million acres of land, about 5 million acres that's really mission critical, that's in private ownership, that helps leverage the ecological values of the public land that belongs to all of us. And so what we do on those lands is really important. And if we follow the pattern of fragmentation that has taken over the Front Range of the Rockies, we're going to lose a lot of this stuff that's right in our midst. Through conservation efforts, we have it before us. And I think what interests Quaman and what interests me in talking to him is that we have this golden opportunity. There's a friend of ours who was the recent science chief, and he's a superintendent at a coastal park in Carolina. And he said his greatest fear about Greater Yellowstone isn't just death by 1,000 cuts, but death by 10,000 scratches. And it's those scratches that all of us partake in, and it leads, you know, ultimately to an unraveling, an ecological unraveling. So the interesting thing to come out of Quaman, from Quaman, is this thread that we're not as insulated. In fact, COVID has made the world smaller, and we live in this place like Greater Yellowstone where the future is really in our hands. Are we going to keep this place woven together, or are we going to let it thoughtlessly fall apart? Remember, not doing anything is a decision. And if we let it go, we'll end up with a place that we no longer recognize.
Yeah, very well said, Todd. Well, look, we really appreciate having you on today. It's, you know, as a friend, as a mentor, as a fellow journalist, you know, the work you're doing at Mountain Journal is fantastic. The work you're doing for us is great. I hope we continue to collaborate and keep asking questions and opening the dialogue. That's what we do.
Well, let me give a plug to you and Eric. It's really important that readers follow the good journalism that you're doing. And, you know, I look forward to collaborating, and I hope people will also look for us at mountainjournal.org. Again, I hope we can do this more often. Thanks for having me on.